Now we'd like to open up for questions, and we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. So who would like to start? Okay, how about me? And my question is, I was watching an interview last night with a scientist, and they were talking. The interview was to have the scientist try to describe what the Higgs boson is and what the Higgs boson field is. So he described it like this: the Higgs boson field is a field which electrons move through, which gives atoms mass. So the electrons move through this field, and then we're able to have the mass that we find at the center of the atom. Empty space is filled with this form-giving field. Could it be that Laozi meditated and contemplated the world and came to this form-giving field and called it Tao in terms of being and nothingness?
Yeah, that's interesting. It might be, actually. It's very amazing that since the very beginning of Chinese philosophy, he came to this understanding that, for example, the Westerners needed 2,000 years to come to this understanding. It might be. I don't actually really know what would be the background of this thinking, because we're not sure who Laozi was. Was he really a person, or the book was edited or written by more authors? So. Yeah, what was specifically your question?
Well, so I imagine that if Laozi was a real person, he's meditating on something. Do you think there's any possible way to correlate what he was meditating on and Tao, the idea of Tao and being in nothingness? Is there any way that could possibly correlate with modern physics, the understanding of modern physics? With a field, an invisible field that gives form to the formless.
Well, I think I ran into something like Einstein's theory of space that is kind of close to what Laozi was talking about non-being, if that's what you refer to. I'm not really familiar with the contemporary physics, but I just know that the modern research, they discovered that the matter is consisted of emptiness. Because if we go deeper and deeper and deeper, molecules and everything, at the end we'll see that actually there is nothing there. There is some kind of emptiness. So maybe this is if we want to correlate them, maybe this would be a nice try. Because we can see that the thing is there, but actually at the final analysis is nothingness. So nothingness, which is not real nothingness, but is something full with content.
Okay, thanks. Other questions?
Yes, I do have. I'm just wondering about, from your point of view, like the foreigner to see the Chinese culture, does the Tao, like Laozi's philosophy, influence Chinese culture? Like from you are the foreigner. Yeah. When you come to a Chinese culture, and do you think the Taoism and the Tao, the Laozi philosophy, influence Chinese people or something?
Yeah. Do you mean if like Tao is present here in Chinese life in society?
What do you think about it?
Well, we can say maybe not Tao itself, but the whole way of thinking. Let's say the Taoist way of thinking. I think that in this society we can see both Confucian culture. I mean, of course, it's mostly Confucian culture, but we can also see elements of Taoism. Yes, there is. Tao is very present in the life of people in Taiwan or in China. Maybe I haven't been there, but I'm sure it is. Especially the concept of Wu Wei that I mentioned, the non-action, because what was I talking today was very theoretical, and from here Laozi takes another point to his practical philosophy, ethics, and political philosophy. And here Wu Wei is the most important, like Tao takes no action but leaves nothing undone. Yeah, I would agree that it's really present in people's life.
Okay, other questions?
I'm more familiar with Laozi's philosophy than with Western philosophy on being and nothingness. So I don't actually know what Sartre said, for example, about nothingness or Heidegger. I mean, I know it's out there. But I don't know what it is. So you're saying that the Western concept of nothingness is like some absolute nothingness. Is that Sartre and Heidegger and?
No, that's the very beginning. Parmenides, Plato,
Okay.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
They all started that line, and I mentioned this specifically because I think that's the reason why most of the time Laozi's philosophy is so attractive to Westerners, because it's a new way of thinking that doesn't exist there. That's why I made a comparison between them. So Heidegger is the one who blames Parmenides or Plato that they did the mistake, and it goes for 2,000 years in the history of Western philosophy.
Okay, other questions? Sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
Other questions?
I do. Okay. You mentioned about Wu Wei in political. How does he work?
Sorry?
Wu Wei in political fields.
How does it work?
Yeah. If you do nothing.
Yeah. How does it work? Well, I don't know. This is maybe a question for a topic for another speech. But okay, I'll try short. Because Laozi claims that all the troubles with the country or with the government is that they are too oppressive, in a way that they are using a kind of consciousness that he calls it like having activity consciousness. That's Yahweh. And by this, the government is actually interfering the people's lives in a way that it's destroying their natural, their simple natural state. Because further from this, from being in nothingness, Laozi goes to explain that that this can be applied in human lives, and that the people have a natural state which is in how do you call this word? So glassy. Together with goes from Tao, like and in the government, in one society, the people need to live this kind of life in relation to Tao, and the governments are actually destroying that, and they are imposing on people many other things from outside, like desires, fake desires, or race for money and for wealth and everything. So Laozi claims that the government should be Wu Wei, which means to let the people develop their natural state that comes from Tao. Is natural. He used the word ziran, which is in modern Chinese means nature, but that time didn't mean nature. It meant a state that comes from itself, from Tao itself, and from ziran. Ziran is the theoretical base of Tao's action, and Wu Wei is the practical. So his idea was that the government should work on or should not try to arise people's desire, unnecessary desires, and for worldly wealth and something, but to have desires to live in accordance with Tao, with the law of Ziran, the natural law. Yeah. I think in 2 minutes I think.
Other questions?
As far as you know, does Laozi have anything to say about being a nothingness in his take as a manifestation of a human condition through individual life? In other words, how does it affect human life, this understanding of ontology, if it affects?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the connection actually between, because the concept of being is not, you cannot just see it as a separated concept. It actually has in itself the concept of Wu Wei, which is non-activity, having no action. And being, as I just replied the question, being in a state in accordance with Tao is actually being in a wu-wei state, in a state without having action, which means being in a state of nothingness. So that's, I think that would be the according to my understanding, the relation between these two.
So what does it mean to being in the state of wu-wei for individual?
Oh, okay, yeah. Like you want to know like concretely what does it mean? Well, I think that's hard to explain. Maybe there is one famous chapter 18 where he explains the best country, like a small country with not many people, and they don't do much, and they don't travel abroad, and they live very simple lives, and they have cars but they don't drive them, and they have weapons and they don't use them. So like probably like a state closer to the natural state, like when we don't have much like these things, you know. Like today if we don't have the mobile phone, then you will feel, if I lose it, then I will feel. So that's the desire Laozi was talking about. The state of non-being is actually this. I mean, why do I need the mobile phone? Of course we need it today. We all live in as Laozi would say, the yo-wei situation, because the government imposes on us. They tell us that we need to have phones, and we buy them, and then we said, yeah, they were right, because if I don't have it now, what will I do? So it's really I did need the phone and other stuff. So, but I think this is still debatable. Depends if there are some people who want to present Laozi as like in a bad light. Then they would say, yeah, you see, Laozi is talking about utopia, something that is not realizable in reality. But there are some people who are also interpreting that this is just a kind of metaphor. Like when he's talking about simple life and small countries, little people, that probably means about your heart, like inside. Like we can see today there are people, for example, who live this kind of lives, maybe walking on the streets here, even in Taipei. Like they don't have mobiles, they don't have nothing. They live simple life. Maybe they would be something closer to what Laozi said.
Bhutan.
Sorry?
Country of Bhutan.
Bhutan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Would that be an example of that?
Okay, I don't know anything about Bhutan, but.
Or Bhutan?
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know a
Korea,
great deal about it, but yeah, then, you know.
Any questions?
So I'd like to ask you, you gave a speech that was like the fundamentals of Taoist philosophy, and that sort of would introduce what is Taoism or what is the Taoist philosophy to people. But what was your motivation for giving this speech? What specifically? And I'm not saying that because I think there's nothing to gain from it. I'm saying what specifically do you want us to walk away from this speech with?
Well, I think the motivation for this was actually my discovery, my personal discovery, that actually the concept of nothingness can be understood in a different way as we usually understand it. And before, when I was younger, when I was studying Laozi, I thought that he was talking about nothingness in this way, as the Western philosophers. And later, the interpreter Wang Bi that I showed, the Wang Bi who did the comments on Laozi, he interpreted nothingness, the concept of Wu as nothingness. And since then, since 3rd or 4th century AD, like Taoism already was gone, because philosophy with using empty concept and try to make it positive, it's not really successful. So I think that was my motivation to do this speech, that because the concept of nothingness is not really nothing, but it's something. It can still be something, but we just maybe use the name nothingness because we are limited by language.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, is there a relationship between Laozi's concept of nothingness and the Buddhist concept of emptiness?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm so sorry that Pavel is not here. He would probably answer you well, because he's studying Buddhism. And I was talking to him about a week ago, and I asked him about the concept of Buddhism. I didn't study much Buddhism and nothing there, but he explained me something that there are different understandings. But as I understood, the Buddhists understand nothingness also is not real, absolute nothingness. So it's closer to Taoism than to Western philosophy. But I don't want to go into details because I really don't know about
it. Buddhism it's an idea of there's a duality. There's nothingness and somethingness, right? Something like that. How would Taoism work? And is it a duality? Is it a singularity? What is it? Is there any idea of duality in Taoism?
There are some commentators who try to characterize it as, I don't know, monism, dualism, or whatever. I think it's not really suitable to call that, because as we see, being and nothingness are just manifestations. They are not. They're dual aspects. They're double character of Tao, but Tao is only one, and Tao actually cannot be separable, cannot be separated. It's always stays one. So in reality, there is no real dualism about this. Although maybe in the literature you might see some commentators, especially from mainland China. If, for example, they say like, oh, Laozi is not suitable to Marxism because he is dualist, or some will say, yeah, Laozi is very suitable to Marxism because he is monist, or whatever, this kind of stuff. But I think I wouldn't go into this kind of characterizations. I think it's not necessary.
Okay, other questions?
On the West, the space is, I think this notion of, the Western notion of nothingness as nothing, it led to many problems, especially if they tried to talk about space, because they didn't know how to explain it. Does space exist if you don't have objects? And some were saying, like Newton were saying, yes, it's absolute, it exists. And Leibniz said, no, it's a relation between objects. So I'm curious about if you know anything about the influence on his thinking on the theory on space, in some sense. How could Laozi define space?
How could he define space? Yeah, that's a good question actually. But I think he didn't go into this astrophysical thinking. I think he was mostly concerned about finding an explanation of how this world exists in order to come to a solution to the problem in the society. So, talking about being and nothingness, it's not in the sphere of physics. It's in the sphere of ontology or me-ontology or trans-metaphysics. So, as I mentioned before, someone mentioned that Einstein's explanation of the space is very similar to what Laozi was talking about nothingness. I think that's all I can say about this. Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah, can you show the slides with the math?
The math.
You're saying that the difference in math, the difference between 0 and 1 is the same as the difference between 1 and 2.
0 and 2.
In math, difference between 0 and
1
1
minus 0 is equal to 2 minus 0. 2 minus 1.
And then what you're saying in Taoism is
I'm saying that mathematically 1 minus 0 is equal to 2 minus 1, right? But then if we look from the point of view of ontology, then 1 minus 0 the difference is actually much bigger than 2 minus 1 or any number, 100 minus 1 or any infinite number minus 1. So the biggest difference, because they are in a different realm. The 0 is nothingness, and the numbers from 1 to infinity are in something.
So basically in math terms, 0 is equal to infinity in the Tao.
No, I said this is the Western ontology. This is not the Laozi's ontology. He tries to get closer the nothingness and the being. Yeah.
Any more questions? How much more time do we have?
infinite.
Infinite more
9
time.
minutes.
Anybody else like to ask a question?
So
Go ahead.
being and nothingness are happening at the same time.
Yeah, we might say that, yes. Because they don't have there is no priority in time. First, there was a being, like there was a time when there was a non-being, and then there was a time when there is non-being and being, and then there is a time when there is non-being, being, and all things. So it's not like this. It's actually like this. They are all at the same time. But I would say the presupposition for all things to be there is the being, and the presupposition for the being to be there is the non-being. And for being and non-being, the presupposition is Tao.
So there's the table, and then the table is also non-table.
Table.
There's the table before we put a name on it, before we give it a function,
Yeah.
which is a function of
Well, it
language.
depends how you look on it. It might be non-table at the same time, but as we understand table as a table because we know what is not table, so we can recognize table as a table. Otherwise, if we don't know, we can call the back a table, and we'll be confused. So, if we want to explain that the table is not table, we can, yeah, but I think that's not what Laozi tried to say. He was trying to say that we are using language to describe these things, and we cannot describe Tao. We cannot say what Tao is. And if you like to use opposites to explain Tao, to describe Tao, then we use being and nothingness as Tao's manifestation. And your question just reminded me, do we have time? Laozi was probably very, not Laozi maybe, but later Zhuangzi was very contra the school of names. There's some philosophers called school of names because they were trying to do this kind of language tricks. Like there is a famous sentence by one of those philosophers that white horse is not a horse. Like there was a state where they say no horse is in this state. So he came with a white horse and they said no horse is inside. He said, but white horse is not a horse. So like he tried to explain why white horse is not a horse and this kind of stuff. But I think that's not what Laozi tried to say.
Could you say that the table, before we put a name and a function on it, the table is nothing?
The table is nothing.
In the Laozi sense.
I don't know.
That would be like in Buddhism saying the table is empty.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. And I think he didn't care much about that actually. What did he mostly care was Tao and the Wu Wei, and how we understand the things are just they're related to our limited reasoning and language.
Because if it's like you're saying, so the language is the agent that actually produce beings. Because you know you can have a stone and then you can call it table and use it as a table, and then the table became a being.
What's the purpose of this? In your opinion, why did Laozi talk about this stuff? What's the purpose?
Why?
I mean, I'm familiar with the idea that it was advice to rulers, but, but you know, it's hard to apply this to governing. So, what do you think?
Well,
I mean, since you've been reading about this and this interests you, what do you think his
Well,
motivation
he
was?
thought he thought that was the right way. I mean, or he or the authors, they thought that was the right way to to explain the world and the government.
So you think he was trying to explain the world? It was the desire to understand.
Well, as I say, it's not the metaphysics is not for the sakes of metaphysics, but for the sakes of his political theory mostly.
You think so?
That's what. Yeah.
I mean, I know they say that. But
Sorry.
I know people say that.
People say that, and I think I do agree. Yeah, because if you just take the metaphysics separated from the political theory, then we come to something and say, okay, so he said this, maybe it's true, maybe not. So what are we going to do with this? And there are people, authors, who do that and did that before, like Western researchers. They would concentrate mostly on his metaphysics, the being and nothingness, and they would just maybe for political theory one paragraph and that's it. But I think yes, that's the most important. He's mostly about this, and usually in philosophy is like that. In order to have a practical philosophy, then you need to have metaphysics first. I mean, those who don't have metaphysics, sometimes they have problems. They don't know how to support their political theory.
I think there's some people who feel like they can have a practical agenda without metaphysics.
Of course.
Not everybody thinks they need that.
Yeah, they can, but who knows what? Who knows how?
Especially say you're
what
a general.
kind of agenda?
You know, say you're a general.
Like for example, anarchism. What does anarchism has as a metaphysical support? Nothing. But where does anarchism work? Nowhere.
I mean, it's a little bit like nothingness. I mean,
although Laozi's philosophy, okay, political philosophy maybe doesn't, we don't see it in practice, but there were cases after the Qin dynasty. I see you're familiar with Chinese history. After the Qin dynasty fell, the very ruthless dynasty in the 2nd century BC or 3rd century BC, there was a new dynasty, Han dynasty, and the king said, from now on there will be only 3 laws. Only for murder, robbery, and what was the third? I forgot. Maybe you remember. Robbery, yeah, murder, robbery, and so like.
do you know?
Some yeah, something. Anyway, so like.
That matters a lot. That would be very important.
Yeah, and his patron was Laozi. Actually, he said, okay, it was enough. The government before was so violent, people already can't live. So we have to do something. So he went totally opposite to Wu Wei. He went to Wu Wei. Although later this law was abolished, but anyway, usually that's mentioned as an example of Laozi's way of ruling the government.
So.
Actually, Laozi's political philosophy, I don't know much about this.
Yeah.
You said because anarchist doesn't have metaphysics, right? But you could link Laozi's, philosophy to some forms of anarchism.
They try to do that, yes. Actually, okay, we are going too far. Maybe anarchism has metaphysics but doesn't have ontology. If they have metaphysics about the human heart or human nature is good or bad, but they don't have ontology, they don't have this background to support that. And Laozi's ontology can be borrowed, and there are some people who did that. I wrote a paper about connecting Laozi's ontology to anarchism, so that this way they can combine each other and finally anarchism to be a sustainable political theory.
Any closing words?
No, well, nothing.
Okay, thanks, Alex.